All right, y'all, welcome back to another part of the Rooted series. Something told me that I really need to just shift my focus right now to the slave trade, transatlantic slave trade, and a lot of those contracts, bills of sale, and just the documentation that's available with regard to some of the companies like the Royal African Company, the South Seas Company, and others when it comes to the big business that was selling African peoples into slavery. Even though, there's a narrative out there that seeks to kind of erase or sanitize or downplay that history and that relevance, which is unfortunate. Um, we got to uncover the truth on this channel. One site that I can kind of appreciate is the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Their dates seem to be a little bit more accurate, and as we know, majority of those brought over from Africa were taken to the Caribbean and the and South America, some in Central America as well. And a lot of what drove um, the slave trade in those areas was sugar, whereas cotton, being king in North America and the South specifically. But I like that, I can appreciate and I like that they have listed some of the major companies and their involvement um, in the slave trade in one place. Like, that's nice because I've had to and I know Wikipedia is not the most reputable of sources. Okay, I know that, but they do reference a lot of reputable sources, and you can always double check, fact check the information. But I've had to kind of look at all of the different companies. I'm gonna be delving into this stuff real deep. And what's interesting too, now that I'm reading through a lot of these resources, because I want to delve into this one, is that and he references Ivan Van Sertima, but I really need to read in its entirety. They came before Columbus. One of the projects I did a few semesters ago in my archaeology course was in reference to some of his work, but I need to read it thoroughly. And it was a project too that I did on Losing a Woman. But this guy, I think is seeking more than anything to preserve the sort of Europeanist perspective, Eurocentrism, and to give homage and respect to that over, that of like the Africanist or Americanist or whatever. And he kind of states that in his writing as well. But there were a few things that I wanted to touch on. And it was really interesting to read the preface of this work and just how much time it took him and how uncomfortable he felt in really expanding on the 18th century, especially with regard to the English and British colonies in North America. But it was interesting to see that he, eventually was able to kind of do that. And he's got a map here of a lot of the states in Africa at that time. And this one's really interesting, the distribution of population of African origin in the Americas 1650. And you see Mexico, Oaxaca, right? Interesting because there is a narrative like expressed in a previous video going around that, Mexico was this safe haven and historically has been this place to support and help our people and all the things. It's just a very incomplete narrative. It's a very incomplete retelling of history and the role that they played. And it hits home for me because my professor a few semesters ago in my African American Studies course, who was Mexican, really kind of introduced some perspectives that I did not agree with for sure. And I think I didn't attend the talk that she gave, so I can't really speak wholly to what points she was making. But I know in one of the posts that I saw from my university on social media, the title of that kind of being like, the allies that Mexicans have been to Black individuals or Black Americans. And it just felt wrong. I mean, there may be some truth in that. There may be. I don't 100% know. But I do know that the sources that I've looked into, and I have looked into reputable sources about it, especially regarding the slave markets in Guadalajara and other Mexican cities, it's very evident that for many years, decades, they played a role and benefited from the enslavement of some of our ancestors, not just from North America, but other parts of the Americas as well. And so, yeah, I just, I don't know. That's just interesting to me. But it's interesting, that this is seen here. All right, so moving on. Okay. And then he really expounds a lot on the different cultural groups in Africa at the time. Let's see. What do I want to? I think it's the end of the introduction. I believe that's what it was. Definitely give this a read. Like I mentioned before, Internet Archives is a really great resource. You can borrow this for free once I'm done with it. Okay. Because I'm borrowing it right now. I think I may purchase this, but it depends. We'll see. I wanted to read this because I think this does a pretty good job at explaining the reality with this and any other kind of work concerning this stuff in these periods of time. So consequently, I've consulted primary sources as much as possible. Obviously, such a strategy is essential if one wishes to make any substantial revision in the existing historiography, and it is particularly necessary when the specialists in Atlantic history, African history, and the history of Africans in the New World have not attempted to ask questions that include the whole Atlantic world. This task is almost impossible to accomplish as completely as one would wish, even though the eventual success of the analysis depends on thorough examination of all the primary material. The research results must be able to convince the Africanists, that no violence has been done to the primary evidence on African history and society, which we don't really know that. The Europeanist, that the essence of European economic and political background is respected. And the Americanist, that the full range of slave societies is considered. And how thorough and accurate you are in that attempt, my goodness, I don't know. No scholar can single-handedly tackle the primary literature in its entirety, even with the help of the existing secondary literature. And readers should be aware of this. The documentation consulted is most complete with regard to African societies and the societies of the Atlantic Islands, and I've examined an extremely large sample of the published and unpublished material. In the Americas, the material on slaves is much more scattered and each item of documentation less complete than for Africa, and moreover, I've consulted only a small, but I trust representative sample. Well, someone else gonna have to be the judge of that, buddy. But anyway, in any case, it ain't me. I'm not the expert, okay? I'm not the historian to judge that, but I'm just saying. In any case, the documentation is incomplete. I can appreciate that acknowledgement, and the analysis thus must be considered more suggestive than conclusive. I can only hope that my reanalysis points in directions that others will find fruitful and that will take up more detailed examination and case studies to refute or support the results reached here. Okay. He did reference Ivan Van Sertima's claim in his book regarding the circumvention of the world and those able to kind of sail through the different currents and winds to make it to the Americas, especially like North America. He did challenge that a little bit, a lot of those perspectives, but I'm not going to really go into that too deeply. I want to... Oh, wait, there was something else, though, in the introduction that I wanted to speak to. Right here. Oh, I'm so grateful I got right to the page. Okay. So, yeah. All right, so I'm going to read this whole page. All right, so the book is divided into two parts, right? The first part examines the detail. The first part examines in detail the nature of the interaction between Africa and Europe. The second part of the book deals with the role that those Africans who went to live in the non-African parts of the Atlantic played in their new societies. It examines some of the institutional background that shaped their participation from the point of view of the dominant powers of the non-African Atlantic, but focuses more particularly on the economic, political, and cultural life of the newly transplanted Africans. And so in many ways, he does acknowledge, this idea of an ethnogenesis and just the cultural differences and the transformation that would happen with the amalgamation of different cultures being exposed to that of European and also the indigenous here. So I can appreciate that. And there's a book entitled History and Dispute. Some of the excerpts of that I've screenshot and put or upload it to my Instagram, the Endivornus Instagram. Again, be sure to follow that and check those sources out. But they do have a chapter in that to discuss whether or not, or pose the question, and also two perspectives on whether or not, those Africans brought over did indeed create essentially a new culture, having been stripped from, and just the psychological damage that happened as a result of being, sold and stripped from their land and, their culture there. But anyway, thus after a chapter sketching the geographical and historical origins of the Atlantic world, the book moves on to an analysis of Euro-African trade and the African productive economy. I conclude that the Atlantic trade was not economically essential to African well-being or development, being as it was largely luxury goods that did not even displace the African luxury goods industry, for example, in the case of textiles, or a relatively minor supplement to existing African industries, for example, the mining and metallurgical industries. Finally, the examination of the economy emphasizes what has increasingly been noted by recent research into African production, that Africa possessed a much more varied and productive economy than has been believed previously. Moreover, my examination of the military and political relations between Africans and Europeans concludes that Africans control the nature of their interactions, with Europe. Europeans did not possess the military power to force Africans to participate in any type of trade, in which their leaders did not wish to engage. Therefore, all African trade with the Atlantic, including the slave trade, had to be voluntary. My goodness. My. And yet so many would refute this, which is like, what? Huh? Who? When? Where? Why? I don't understand. Anyway, finally, a careful look at the slave trade and the process of acquisition of slaves argues that slaves had long been used in African societies, that African political systems placed a great importance on the legal relationship of slavery for political purposes, and that relatively large number of people were likely to be slaves at any time, because so much of the process, it is a process, y'all. Them folks ain't just walk up on there, take the people and come up over here. No. It was a process, of acquisition, transfer, and sale of slaves was under the control of African states and elites. They were able to protect themselves from the demographic impact and transfer the considerable social dislocations to poor members of their own society. In the second part of the book, the emphasis shifts to the New World and the contributions of African slaves to the Americas after considering the conditions that made African slaves so attractive to European colonists in the New World, and also ironically placed them in a good position to be central actors in the new cultural milieu of the Atlantic world. The analysis then focused on the nature of slavery with an eye to assessing the likelihood of enslaved Africans playing a larger role than is usually assigned to them in the cultural and social world of their enslavers. On the whole, the evidence supports the idea that at least some, and probably a significant number in all parts of the Atlantic world, possessed sufficient freedom of movement and social interaction to participate actively in the cultural life of the region. The focus then shifts to the issue of culture and examines the cultural zones of Africa, their interactions with each other and with Europeans, and the development of an Afro-Atlantic culture. It then examines the role that African culture, and African institutions have played in such diverse matters as slave rebellions, communities of runaways, and the cultural and religious life of the New World, considering the influences of, those indigenous here, and just how culture tends to naturally evolve through experience and space and location and all of the things, right? I guess I'll keep reading this. The second part of the book has been buttressed by research that demonstrates the European influences on African life, such as Christianity, Creole languages, and fashion, were often encountered first in Africa and only later transferred to the Americas. Thus, where Africans have borrowed from Europeans, they often did so willingly and on their own terms in their home territories, and not always under the stultifying influence of slavery. How African culture changed on its own and how it incorporated foreign influences are examined to reveal a deep dynamic functioning in Africa that would be unleashed in the Americas. The research that supports these conclusions, both for Africa and for the New World. So again, he's making a distinction between how Africans at that time interacted with other nations to develop their different cultures. They're under the coloniality and influence of Europeans, and also how that manifested in the New World with those Africans that would be brought over. The research that supports these conclusions, both for Africa and for the New World, has necessarily had to involve a reassessment that goes counter to the analysis of much of the secondary literature. In large measure, this is because the primary concern of most researchers has been local rather than international. Thus, Africanists have not always addressed themselves to those issues in African society and history that would clarify African interactions with the Atlantic world, especially how the African background of Afro-American slaves affected their response to their new environment. As a result, Americanists, whose principal concern is the fate of the African once they've arrived in the Americas, have not had a secondary literature about Africa written with their concerns in mind. Of those whose interest is in trade and economic interactions, few indeed have known enough about the areas outside their specialty to attempt independent analysis and synthesis. Consequently, I've consulted primary sources as much as is possible. Okay, and we read that. All right, so then let's see. Where did I want to? Oh, let me go to my bookmark. There we go. Because what did I want to read? Let's see. Yeah, this was very interesting and disturbing to read, for sure, about the fear that a lot of these slaves had with being eaten and consumed and turned into oil and gunpowder, their flesh. And honestly, with a lot of what's been uncovered about the chattel slavery here in North America specifically, and what they did to our ancestors, especially during Jim Crow. And you read books like Medical Apartheid and Without Sanctuary and Delectable Negro. And this isn't surprising, unfortunately, that they had fears even prior to. I mean, that spirit, that evil, lustful desire to cannibalize, which, don't get me wrong, there were some African nations that were responsible also for participating in those things. Like I said, there is a connection between Esau and Canaan, the one that was forbidden by God himself. And we're going to kind of get into that in other sources in other times. But yeah, it's something just so demonic to be that cannibalistic and that cruel and just barbaric to turn any human matter like that into oil, gunpowder. And the thing is, when you think about our time here on this land in the Americas, for those of different ethnic groups, but specifically foundational Black Americans, and you think about our experiences here of our ancestors, and even the industries right now that are fueled continually still by our blood, by our organs, by our suffering, by, oh my God, even the furniture filled with our hair. Like, when you think about all of that, that's just, that's another kind of sadistic, and just utterly disturbing. But anyway, certainly a form of evil, like never seen before. And even scripture in Obadiah, said, listen, y'all have gone way too far. have gone way too far. And that's why I know you cannot convince me otherwise, that these people are being led by principalities and powers and spirits, um, beyond just their carnal abilities and desires. It's deeper than that. It's darker than that. It has to be, because there's no way. There's just no way. But anyway, all right. There was something else that I wanted to read though. Ah, yes. Okay. Yeah, because and shout out again, I think I mentioned her a few times in the other portions of this Rooted series, but shout out to Joy, Dr. Joy DeGruy. If you don't know who she is, if you have not checked out her work, be sure to do so on post-traumatic slave syndrome. But here he kind of speaks to the psychological shock. I think I was trying to say that all together, of the experiences on those slave ships, and in those holding cells waiting to be sold, and just all the things. And so many people, so many of those individuals not only took their lives out of just a level of dignity, but also died on the way, on the journey, and while waiting to be sold. So the few that came over to North America, out of those, even less made it alive. And if they did make it alive, even less made it beyond a few weeks or a few months, right? So yeah. And so yeah, I just think that's so interesting that from what I read so far, there's not much mention about the Aborigines or Indigenous, other than, acknowledging that they also were, in servitude of some kind, a little bit different though, and all of that, but still just the amalgamation again of those cultures, like not much is spoken about in this particular work from what I've seen so far. But I wanted to read this. Yeah, and again, shout out to Joy DeGruy, because there really isn't much work done about, even just the theories on the psychological trauma of enduring just that journey here, let alone the experience, the transformative experience once they landed here, All right, slave life in the Atlantic world. I'm going to read this a little bit. I only got 7 minutes. Oh my gosh. Okay. It is impossible to generalize about the way of life in the Atlantic world for slaves, given the vast array of duties that slaves performed. Even within one type of work, such as plantation labor, conditions varied widely depending on the personality of the master, on the agronomy of the plantation, and on the availability of various types of labor. Thus, statements dealing with the cultural impact of slaves that stress the nature of their work environment necessarily must address the characteristics of each region. Earlier historians tended to focus on the extremes, life as highly exploited workers on some plantations and the pampered existence of the domestic slave. It was the first of these prospects that one found in the rural enterprises as the main workforce, and it is in their case that the most extreme statements about the deculturalizing process, development of dependent personalities, and the eradication of Afro-Atlantic culture have been made. Conditions on some plantations certainly inhibited the development and transmission of a full cultural life. For example, where most slaves were male, were housed in barracks, worked for very long hours, and lived short lives, their opportunities for cultural interaction were limited, just as their prospects of forming a family and socializing children in this culture were limited. On the other hand, where conditions permitted slaves to build their own houses and lives, and families, and raise children, the chances for continuing African culture, creating a new Afro-American culture from the blending of African and European elements and indigenous, and subsequently transmitting this culture through generations, were, kept alive. We will now examine life under various labor regimes and labor systems with a special eye to determine the degree to which Atlantic societies permitted slaves the opportunities for cultural interaction, community development, and socialization of children, first on rural estates, and then in the special case of domestic service and urban life. And if you go back and read through a lot of the slave narratives, you can kind of see the elements that were bred out of their conditions, and not many of them if any of them, directly link back to a lot of those nation states at the time in Africa and those cultures, nor especially not the countries that are there now, which many of them being founded and existing not much long ago, like in the 1800s, 1900s, and through migration and just through intermixing, like a lot of those populations and peoples having had many ethnogenesis, is that a word? On their own. After so many generations, I mean, they're not even the same people anymore. So that's why we are so adamant, those in my community, about this desire to stake claim to, our history here, and to not respect or honor the fact that we are so different, especially from the continental Africa that exists now, and those many, many tribes and many, many ethnic groups, so different, so very different. And that came as a result of what we experienced here, which was unlike any other kind of indentured servitude, serfdom, or enslavement. Unlike any other kind, specifically in the Americas. And even just making distinction between the type of treatment and conditions from one America to the next was varied, and even in this particular work, he makes comparison between the Caribbean and North America, and because there is a belief that a lot of what was endured in like the Caribbean and South America conditions, especially by like the Portuguese and what have you, were much worse than North America. And the thing is, in some cases it was, but in some cases it wasn't, or in some cases it was the same. But it's not, I mean, we should never get into a situation where we're up here comparing suffering, especially when there has already been a divide and distinction with which particular nations of people perpetrated that. You know what I'm saying? Like, if you know that much of the conditions and the institution of enslavement was perpetuated by a particular people, the British, the English, the Portuguese, the Spanish, and there's distinctions in that, then that is where your issue lies, really, not with the victims of those systems and other lands who have gone on to form different ethnic identities from you. I think we can all acknowledge that we were all, and our ancestors were all, victims of that, and it was horrible and horrific. It was terrible, you know what I mean? But it shouldn't be a matter of us comparing the suffering. Like, it was all suffering. And again, those powers that were and that be are responsible for repairing a lot of that. And the differences of how our cultures evolved as a result of the location and experiences are what they are. And even when there was sometimes trade or selling of slaves from the Caribbean to the North, and vice versa, in exchange for Africans or the indigenous or what have you, that didn't happen. Those people weren't in those places for very long, like not even a few years. And so whatever would have transpired or happened, would not have necessarily changed whatever cultural identity those people would have developed, where they spent most of their time and underwent the most trauma. It was just a matter of exchange and trade. But shoot, this is about to end. Please be sure to like, subscribe, comment. We're going to pick this up in another part and keep digging deeper into these resources. Thank y'all for tuning in. Be blessed.